I'm not saying we have the same results in terms of numbers, but in a legislative sense and a judicial sense, the possibilities to apply these laws and play with these laws, as you said, as the situation for French Polynesia and New Caledonia and Wallis and Futuna, is it the same?
Oui, ça s'applique de la même façon. Alors,
Yes, it's applied in the same way. I was only saying a while ago with Jean-Marc Regnault and Jean Frankel, who worked on Wallis and Futuna, who realized that when you have this kind of relationship, and I remind you that Wallis and Futuna is something very special within the Republic. Of course, they managed to cheat, but almost with the approval of the population. These are special circumstances. And you're talking about New Caledonia. I was in an island in New Caledonia, and I asked who the mayor was, and I was told it's the chief. And so the custom chief is elected. I said, well, he's elected with what, 100%? And they said, no, 95%. There's always 5% of people who... And so he's saying that the 5% are... sorry, I can't translate emmerdeur. I'll explain later. But the law against equal representation is applied. It has to be applied. And you've seen the scores, the figures. We have the same figures, nearly 45% in New Caledonia and in French Polynesia. So we can imagine that in Wallis and Futuna, they're not going to remain for too long in those traditions. But we're in a political life that is very, very far removed from that of French Polynesia and New Caledonia. Okay, it's provocation now, but we're talking about gender. Does the law about equal representation is still valid? Is it not obsolete? Now that we're talking about gender, this equal representation could go beyond men and women.
C'est une très bonne question parce que en fait,
that's a great question because it was asked actually, and some specialists have explained that if we open equal representation, it could become extremely complicated. So those that are against equal representation say you're opening up to the door to positive discrimination, and once you do that, you'll have to think about a little bit like in the American way, homosexuals, bisexuals, and then we're going to apply this to people of color with their origin. Those who are against equal representation say you're opening up the door towards positive discrimination. So they're saying no because, the answer is no because it's a different discussion. This is gender as sex. So if we're talking about homosexuality or bisexuality or whatever, we're not really talking about sex. This is why the supporters of equal representation say that if we open up in this direction, we won't go there because this is where we are. That's the first thing. The second thing, the most clever are saying, wait until we really reach equal representation, and then we can talk about the rest. And there's still plenty of time for that. A question for Nicole. Do the multi-faith meetings of women, did they have any effect? And if yes, which effects? Was there an easing of the tensions between the communities?
Thank you for that question. I think it was from Louis-Marie. I'd like to just contextualize what I was saying a little bit, so that that scenario that I was talking about was kicked off, began in the wake of the 2000 coup. Then Fiji had another coup in 2006. So it's currently, we have another military government in place. But this government came to power because it was this coup occurred rather, because the military leader was protesting against what he said was a kind of an ethnicization of the state. The nationalist government was catering too much to the political interests of the Fijian population, even though the Fiji army is majority Indigenous personnel. So the context has changed slightly, and it's been a very repressive regime. So in that time, I think the peace vigils, when that coup first occurred in 2006, women immediately reactivated the peace vigils, but they became very scared very quickly because the regime cracked down very hard on any kind of dissenting activity. And even though it was inside a church, and they didn't threaten that activity, the women who were planning those meetings became worried about the fact that they may endanger the participants. So for a while they stopped. But since 2000, there has been a strong pro-democracy movement that grew out of some of that religious and faith-based peace activism that was more instantaneous. So those church vigils in 2000 did give birth to more secular civil society activity, and also organizations that have worked hard since to really encourage young women to become politically informed. So they've been quite important, I think, for politicizing a younger group of women around the importance of peace building, about recognizing the extent to which that doesn't have to only be a secularized agenda, and that there are important religious traditions that they can draw on. I think the most significant thing that has happened is it has made the international aid community aware of the fact that when we talk about women's participation in civil society, that we don't only fund secular groups, that we become aware of the place of activism that is more coming out of a religious context, or a faith-based context. And so not to be worried if they see, or they fund a meeting that is bringing women's groups together in Fiji, and they see the Fiji Muslim League, Fiji Muslim Women's League attending, as well as the Fiji Methodist Church. That there's a basis for that interfaith discussion there now, and I think that's been important too. Has the racial tensions generally overall in Fiji abated? I can't answer that question, I don't know. I think it's still very strong, but there is a long colonial history to racialized tension in Fiji. So, we can't expect this type of activity to undermine 130, 40 years of a very determined colonial project to kind of create division. So, there are strong colonial legacies that have fueled that tension. But I think this, often all we hear about is racialized politics in Fiji and the dangers of racialized politics in Fiji, and certainly in Australia, that's something that's very visible in media analysis and a lot of academic analysis of the challenges that Fiji faces. And so I think the kind of work that I'm doing is just presenting another side to that story that really exposes the extent to which, yes, that side's there, the racialized tension is there, but there are other ways, and there are ways that is also being challenged inside the country.
Une question pour le général. En vous écoutant, je me disais que ça.
So I was telling myself that maybe there's a collective which should be favorable to this new legislative element, but I didn't hear it in your presentation. The equivalent of tomboys, the lesbians, which seems to have no place as such in this society. And I was wondering if you had the opportunity to hear commentaries about that, because I imagine that if it's like the rest of Polynesia, this asymmetry between a recognized place for effeminate men, but none at all for women with masculine tendencies. Logically, these groups should be interested by what's going on the legislative level. Do you have anything about
J'ai
that?
rencontré des personnes homosexuelles, hommes et femmes.
I met homosexual people, men and women, less women, because I don't know too many of them. It's just, circumstances that mean that I met less of them. But in this country, of course,
Des personnes qui sont très
there are people who are very strongly in favor of the application of the PACS and who are also very much in favor of this new law.
Et parmi ces personnes, il y a des
And among those people, there are homosexual couples who are very happy about this new law. And since my subject was to research resistance and objections, oppositions to these two texts of law, I didn't meet the people who were in favor, who were happy with this new law. But of course, these people do exist in Polynesia.
Polynésie.
Are there any lesbian organizations here? Yes, associations. Mr. Alwadi, when you were saying that, is there really a difference between men and women in politics? The fact that we have women now in the Territorial Assembly, does it change anything? I think that there are texts that were passed recently at the initiative of women that would not have been passed at the initiative of men. I'm thinking of the PACS, the law against sexual and moral harassment that was passed last year. I'm thinking that we are complementary, and the criticism I have for equal representation is that it came as a block. That we were not trained, we were not well informed. It really wasn't enough. And when I arrived in 2008, and I know about the law, this is my specialty, but the women who were here before me had difficulties. I'm not talking about men who are politicians and who think that they have enough of an electorate to be there. But it's quite strange because I hear that women who enter the assembly should be skillful, but I never hear that men should be not skillful but competent. And it's a problem for me, this type of discourse, because once again we're asking of the woman to be a superwoman, and we're not superwomen. We also have a family life, and I am in favor of the PACS, but I am married. So when I talked about the PACS, everybody said, "Oh, she's homosexual." No, I'm married, I have children, but I'm for human rights. I'm in favor of human rights. So for me, equal representation is not complete in Polynesia. We do have the text, but we have huge difficulties in the application because now women have to appropriate this movement of equal representation, and it's beginning. We have new generations coming into the assembly, more and more young women who impose themselves because they have the competence and it helps them in their day-to-day work. But at one stage you have to tell the government, listen, what you're offering us, I'm sorry, but I have a bill to present, I have an amendment to present, something you wouldn't hear 10 years ago, but now you hear it, and you see elected representatives trying to pass bills and speaking up. There's very few of us in the assembly who dare to speak up, not because they're not competent, it's because they don't have the training. So we were lucky enough to have a president this year who gave us training, and I think this will go on, that we'll be able to exchange. And if I came here at this conference, is because I wanted to have as much information as possible in order to train myself. And I'd like to ask you, are you aware of any models of equal representation where there was a real accompaniment? Because the law is fine, but we need the practice as well. So if the elected representatives are not helped, we have plenty of elected people, elected women in the towns, especially in rural areas. Is there any models, any systems others than what we have here on which we could lean in order to help and to better this aspect of equal representation? First of all, the feeling of incompetence that I mentioned earlier, and which is developed by Delphine Dulong, this feeling of incompetence of women, this feeling that they feel, why do they refuse to move into politics? Because they have this feeling of incompetence. So the analysis is not that whether they should or should not go. That's not the problem. The same question can be applied to men, as you said. I remember attending debates at the Assembly at one time. I have a student, for example, who is looking into the calculations, the number of diplomas of elected representatives at the Assembly a few years ago, where all the work was coming from the presidency, and there were fake reporters in the Assembly who were reading texts that were coming from the presidency, from the presidential palace. So, and we knew that they were reading the text, and sometimes the lawmakers in the presidency, they were asked to do it in a more simple way. So the feeling of incompetence comes from the women themselves, and that's the study that was done by Dumont to ask why they had this feeling of incompetence. And when people came to get them and said, well, we have equal representation, we have to go, they would say, no, I can go. It came from them. And the question is why? Because they were excluded from the political game, and they believed, they managed to interiorize so-called incompetence that wasn't there. So if we're talking about incompetence globally, there is this feeling, but the competence was very well shared by everyone. So, but things are moving forward. As well as equal representation with the students, we're seeing that diplomas are gaining ground at the Assembly. And we can pass bills, opposition exists because it didn't exist before. And even men are changing. You're talking about PACS. Who was talking about PACS with you? The President of the Assembly. But when he was a deputy, he voted against it. He asked it not to be applied in Polynesia. You changed him. Yes, the same guy who said no at the National Assembly. And I love that, you know, he changed. Second question, very quickly. Béatrice Vernodon, when she was deputy, had created an association to explain to all these women, and had sessions at the Assembly. And we at the university had been invited to explain, but explain in a very basic, at the lowest level. And we asked what the level was, and we explained what political life was. And we had 2 sessions organized at the Territorial Assembly, and we were very surprised because we saw mostly elected people from the towns, and they had no idea about law. And Béatrice Vernodon is no longer a deputy, so she didn't have maybe the financing, so that stopped.
Mais en fait, ça dépend de vous.
A question for Marie-Noël about couples who might be interested by a PACS here in Polynesia. When we talked, when the debate was on in 1999 in France, the debate was around a same-sex couple. And today we know that these couples have used the PACS, but 95% of PACSes, it was very successful, are heterosexual couples. So PACS also answered a need linked to the development of free union in France, which is not the same as what was there before, because it's a way of living that is completely integrated with children. Half the children are born of parents that are not married. And so one of the reasons why a non-married couple signed the PACS was because it gives you a fiscal benefit. So you can have a common declaration of revenue, so it's definitely a benefit, because there are not too many more benefits with PACS. So my question is, independently from the fact that the principles for which we hope the PACS will be adopted in Polynesia, what are the social situations to which PACS would answer? It's less in the fiscal sense, because if you look at the specificity of the fiscal world in Polynesia, it's more about the organization of the management of material goods that may be interesting for a number of people living in free union. And the aspect that is most interesting for them is about PACS, the patrimonial aspects. A similar question, well, a remark first. I think it's a little bit dangerous to trust historical evidences when we're judging a marriage for in French Polynesia. The fact that homosexuality, the mahu, etc., existed before first contact, so it proves homosexuality, but the word hadn't been invented yet, so it's an anachronism. There's no evidence of mahu becoming living in free union with a Tahitian man in the first years of the contact. And it's still more or less the same thing. There's a debate going on in Hawaii where there's plenty of evidence that is presented as historical evidence, but in fact are quite doubtful, that put labels that are not appropriate, not relevant to historical phenomena. But my question is linked to this. When you interviewed Mahu and Rere, I'm wondering who are they going to marry? Because of course they have sexual relations with straight men. So a straight man is not going to sacrifice his social status by getting married to a person of the same sex and lose his position in the dominant society. Yes, that's absolutely right. And these people couldn't see any benefit.
I guess what I wanted to talk about was the situation in New Caledonia a little bit, which I've been looking at quite closely, and the operation of parity in that context. And I guess I'm responding to the last question that you put with your conclusion, is parity necessary or why is it necessary? I think there's another reason why it's necessary. It's necessary in a broader regional context because you mentioned that, you know, the women's political representation across the Pacific Islands is at the lowest level in the world. So the lowest levels globally of women's political representation. And I think the structures that have worked so well in the French territories of the Pacific are looked at with great interest by would-be women politicians and would-be women political candidates as a model for the region, potentially, a potential model. I know the electoral system is different. I know not all countries have proportional representation. But particularly what I've seen in New Caledonia, what I've observed, is the fact that women have achieved high political office since parity has been introduced there. And they have also mobilized state resources in a way that means there have been new institutions created by the state, principally for women. And we don't see that state commitment to the question of, women's equality or women's advancement. We don't see that made by the state in other Pacific Island countries. A lot of the discussion around the status of women in other Pacific Island countries is being led by civil society organizations. It's an activist agenda. And I think what's really interesting, and I'm very interested in what's happened in French Polynesia because I don't know very much about it. But I think I can make a strong case that it has really assisted the state commitment to, or a state attentiveness to the status of women in New Caledonia. That's quite unique, at least in Melanesia, if not regionally. So I just wanted to make that observation about the extent to which it's a necessary thing to have in place regionally.
Alors, voilà, oui, ça illustre tout à fait.
Yes, this completely illustrates what was said. If the state doesn't push, doesn't enforce it, nothing happens in any country. And if there's a difference in Oceania between Polynesia and Caledonia and the rest of Oceania, it is because there is a law on equal representation. So when you say that it comes from civil society, that is so true. There was a meeting of women this summer, Oceanian women, and they had invited our women politicians from Polynesia so that they would come and explain clearly how parity, how equal representation works. But the reason why I gave two examples, Vanuatu and Cook Islands, it is moving forward. I'm not saying everything is stopped, because those figures by John Frankel that were recorded, collected for the Pacific Forum are from 2006. But between 2006 and now, in those states, outside of the French territories, we're trying to slowly bring a few rules. When I said one woman in the municipal council in Vanuatu with one seat reserved, it sounds ridiculous, but it is something. That means that the consciousness are evolving. And I'll finish by saying that Polynesia has gathered in April all the presidents of the parliaments of Polynesia. The GPP, Groupe Parlementaire Polynésien. So the state that imposes equal representation to French Polynesia, then you have the elected representatives of French Polynesia who are encouraging other Polynesian territories to do the same, to enforce equal representation. And it's Jacques Drolet, as president of the Assembly, who has written in the charter that was signed by all the states and territories present to create this group of Polynesian parliamentaries. It is indispensable that women have as much of a place as men in parliaments. And all the presidents who were there have signed this charter. So it touches both levels, civil society, which I think will be the more efficient, and curiously, the parliamentaries. No, we don't say that in French, but the parliamentaries from Polynesia who are pushing the others to do the same, encouraging them to do the same. But if the law had not come from France, there would never have been a law about equal representation in French Polynesia. If I may, this is interesting because you talk about the US and the laws that you find too exaggerated. But in fact, in the US are a model because the movement of civil rights of the 1960s with American black people is at the root of all this. So we shouldn't move away from this. We have to remember that something very important there. The fact that, this goes back to the previous discussion, the laws are very important, but are not enough. There needs to be a social change that is outside the realm of the law, but that is also helped by the laws. If we didn't have the abrogation of interracial marriage, where would we be now?
Alors, il faudrait dire deux choses pour ça.
I just want to say two things about that. Yes, the American system and affirmative action comes from there. The only thing is that what I meant to say is that there needs to be a correspondence between something very deep, the philosophy, the Republican philosophy. We have to find a balance between the two, otherwise we won't be able to move forward, because the Republican principles are so deeply anchored. I'll give you an example. French Polynesia has asked for positive discrimination, affirmative action, for buying land and for employment, so that Polynesian people would have priority for employment. And France refused for many years. In the name of these principles, France fought against the privileges of the nobility, and after the French Revolution, we couldn't come back to what was there before. So we had to create this philosophical arrangement about socially broken, and there needs to be an arrangement with a deeply anchored philosophy in the Republic and the necessity to put this into place. So we cannot take all our inspiration from the American system. Just one point. In France, we have decentralization. Political parties, in their great majority, most parties from the right wing, were against it. Even the Communist Party at one stage, against decentralization. But the law imposed it in 1982. But gradually, this law, the result was that all the elected representatives of the party came from decentralization. So after 20 years, everybody was in favor of decentralization. Why am I saying this? Because for equal representation, from the moment women have to be there, of course they have to be trained and everything, I know, I agree. But in 10 years' time, in metropolitan France, when all the political parties have elected women, the place of the woman will be, I'm not going to say natural, but it's going to become more natural. But at the beginning, there is the law.
Très bien.